So I'm going to talk a bit now about the AWE journey through this ecosystem. So I've been with the AWE now for about 2.5 years. And as was described earlier on, we're definitely on this journey that I'm sure so many of us are on in terms of moving from a sort of administrative function through to something that is much more about value add and really aligning to the organization. So when I joined, this was kind of what we had. And I've referred to it here as the accidental ecosystem, because I don't think it was designed as such. It was something that just sort of happened. It grew up organically as our program was starting to grow. Now, a few years ago, AWE was relatively stable in terms of what it was delivering and how it was delivering it. We're now going through a huge amount of transformation, and that has generated a number of different project areas, both in transformation space and change space, but a huge amount of investment in our infrastructure. So as that investment grew, so did the organic PMOs that we see here on this screen. So we had this very accidental ecosystem. Now, not looking quite as uniform and neat as some of the previous slides. So we had different sizes, we had different shapes, and actually we had a very small PMO sitting in the center. The one thing I'll describe about that PMO in the center was it was very much a postbox PMO. So exactly as described earlier on, I'm not sure that there was a huge amount of value add beyond being able to have somewhere for people to send their information to be packaged up nicely that we could then use to send to, in our case, our executives and our customers to say, this is how we're getting on with our projects and programs. That was what that PMO did. And actually, that was what the business wanted. It suited the business at the time. It was what the business needed. So it was a postbox PMO. So that meant communication coming in was quite one way. There was a lot of information coming in, not a lot of value add coming out, not a lot of that kind of analysis and that kind of value add that we talked about this morning coming back out to those spokes. Also at the time, there was very little urgency, I suppose, around integrating. All of these different areas could deliver to some extent on their own. This need for a more integrated picture didn't exist in the same way that we have today. And that meant there wasn't the same driver for consistency in our project and program practices. So Eileen talked about a centre of excellence. That didn't necessarily exist in the same way as we have it today, because actually there wasn't that same need. Everybody was relatively comfortable that those spokes actually had their own processes that suited their area. I talked earlier on about the fact that we're all designed around project types. Infrastructure projects do look very different from IT projects. IT projects absolutely look quite different from transformation programs. And so actually all of these different spokes were able to form some of their own methodology, their own way of working, and that worked for us as an organization. Back to the postbox PMO, there's very much a focus on monitoring delivery, and that was something we heard about this morning as well. Not that strategic level planning, not that prioritization, not that support to strategic decision making, which is where we get that value add as we talked this morning. We also heard about education, about knowing what PMOs are and how sometimes the people that know best about what a PMO can and should be doing are the people in the PMO, not necessarily the people that you're delivering into. And that was most definitely the case, I think, where I am at the moment. And we had a very low understanding about portfolio management and what it could bring to the organization. And that's something we've really been on a journey on the last few years. And again, it wasn't just in terms of people's understanding about what the PMO could offer. It was also within our own community. Exactly as we heard this morning, a lot of the people in the organization were really, really, really talented in terms of project and program management, but we were slightly short on skills in terms of portfolio management and professional PMOing. And also, there was very little need or drive to sort of improve that practice. We talked about the fact that we had these project types. They had almost like their own little centres of excellence. They were excellent in their own areas, which was fine. We didn't have that need to bring that consistency across the business. Now, my point at the bottom, and the reflected point here, was when I arrived, I think my first thought was, oh my goodness, you know, this looks a bit odd. It's not what I'm used to. It looks like quite an immature solution. But exactly as we heard this morning, we need to make sure that we're judging maturity based on the business need. What is it that's needed for the business at the time? So though this looked immature, actually it had been working for the business at the time, given the organizational context, the projects and programs and the way that they were structured, and also the business need. So this was working at the time. I was brought in, this was what I was presented with, but we were on the verge of change, and that was the point of forming up my role as EPMO director. So we moved then to this. So my role was to start up the ePMO. We had this emerging need for integration. Now, I talked a lot about the transformation program that we have underway at AWE. Lots of infrastructure builds. We're thinking about what our future deterrent system is going to look like, and for that, we need to build new infrastructure and new facilities to support that delivery. So everything in AWE is very, very linked. It's an interdependent program these days with huge complexity. So needing to understand as a PMO, what does that integrated picture really look like, was starting to become a driver. We talked earlier on about who your sponsors are and having a really good sponsor. When I joined the organisation, we had a fantastic sponsor who was all about bringing consistency of project and programme management practice and building a PMO. And his phrase was, building a PMO from the bottom up. And this was a really good strategy. The idea was that actually, if we could get everybody to work consistently in a consistent way, we get really good quality data, then bubble up, and we'd magically be able to make decisions based on that data. So we had this really good sponsor and this real drive to start to add consistency both to our data and processes. Talked about the transformation agenda. It was already underway, but it started to really gain momentum in AWE as we were on this verge of this change. And we were starting to see delivery constraints. As we upped the pace of our program, we were starting to see some constraints we were going to have to manage. Did we really have enough people in the right places to be able to do what we were doing? I talked about the amount of infrastructure we're investing in, where were the constraints of the supply chain, were we going to have enough concrete, is there enough steel, all these other sorts of considerations. So there's lots of things in our world that are starting to constrain us as we start to grow and transform our business. And we were starting to need to start to manage that. We also had this drive to really professionalize P3M, project, program, and portfolio management within AWE. We absolutely recognize the need to be able to retain our people and to be able to recruit really high standards of project professionals. So actually, to do that, we have to offer something back to those people. We need to say that P3M is a profession in AWE that is valued. We need to make sure those people have those right career paths and have that right mobility within the organisation. It has to be somewhere that people want to come and work, and it absolutely has to be somewhere that people want to stay. So there's loads of things that were driving us in the right direction, but there was a few buts. In this hub and spoke model that we had, rather than bringing all of this together, we created some competing drivers. Not everybody was quite bought into the vision, and therefore the spokes, in some cases, had that competency that I talked about before that gave them that autonomy, weren't necessarily working to the same kind of agenda, I guess, as we wanted to as a whole organisation. We did have the ePMO, but still, I've got those dotty lines on that slide, still those two-way communications felt a bit transactional. We weren't having that flow of information, that flow of conversation, that flow of value between the two. It still felt like a bit of a transactional relationship. And we still didn't really understand the business need, or everybody had a different interpretation of what that business need was. So to be fair to everybody who is working in this space, everybody's working to the business need as they saw it. We didn't have that coherent, joined-up view about what that might be, and that led to that fragmentation we heard about earlier on, and some of that transactional working. So I refer to this one as the tatty ecosystem. We were sort of there. We'd said we needed an ePMO. We'd started to set up this centre of excellence that was starting to add that consistency in our projects and programmes. We developed a framework, and we were trying to roll that out across the business. We were really struggling to land it. The PMOs on the outside were struggling to understand what the ePMO was there for. They were struggling to really understand what we could offer them. What was that two-way relationship going to look like? And we ended up with that sort of transactional piece. So we sort of had some of the building blocks in place. We had a fantastic sponsor, but the organisation just wasn't quite aligned with what we were trying to do. So roll on a couple of years, and this is really where we are now. We've made some huge changes, but actually the huge changes that we've made in AWE are not necessarily from within the PMO. It's not things we have been on a massive maturity journey in terms of everything we're doing inside out. The real changes that we've had are from the outside in. And they're really concerned with that third piece I talked about in that reflective practice around organisational context. So we started to think about how more integrated we need to view the programme and what's the role of the PMO in that integration. And now the PMO's role is to do that integration across all the projects and programs to give us that really high-level view and that North Star, as we refer to it, for our delivery. And that really creates that drive for consistency, for high-quality data, because without that, that North Star isn't as clear. We have got some real constraints around our portfolio now. It is a vast portfolio. It's very, very diverse. We're making some really significant investment. And that means we need to really have those portfolio management skills. We need to make sure that we can prioritize. We need to make sure that we can put the right people in the right places, put the money in the right places to make sure we're aligning with our strategic priorities and our objectives. And that's a constant balancing exercise we need to do. So that pull for portfolio management, because of the environment we're in, is really starting to emerge. We have real clear articulation now in IWE about our organizational vision, and the challenge has really helped to align those stakeholders. So in that TATI ecosystem, I sort of talked about everybody was working to the business need as they saw it. I think now we're in a much better place. Everybody shares that business need. And there is, as I say, that requirement for greater control, that need to center of excellence has really come through. You'll see on this diagram that we actually put the center of excellence in that wider circle now around it. One of the big changes that we made around 6 months ago was to split the EPMO, sorry, I'm not supposed to use the word split, decouple the EPMO from the center of excellence, because actually we had reached our own critical mass. We got to the point where actually the EPMO in its previous form, trying to do center of excellence and portfolio management, was now a bit unmanageable as a unit. So actually what we've now done is separate those two. So we now have a very clear center of excellence in the form of our P3M function, and we have a portfolio management office, the EPMO, dealing with that balancing and that prioritization and really doing that adding value in terms of that strategic decision making. So that's a big change that has been made, and the fact we now recognize the need for center of excellence, transparency in terms of our data, improvements and consistency in that data quality is really key. One of the other big changes I think that we've had is around consistency in the accountabilities. We've done a huge amount of work to try and tidy up that TATI ecosystem. Rather than these being things that have grown up organically, we've now said we're going to design what that PMO looks like. We're going to think really carefully about what the remit is of that PMO. What is it doing? What's the person, what's the roles and responsibilities of the person leading that? And making sure we've got some commonality across the business about those things. So as time goes on, if you speak to one head of PMO in AWE, they will be able to look like the same job as somebody else doing a head of PMO. It will always have to be tailored because, as we've already said, infrastructure projects are very different from IT, from transformation, and from warhead technologies. However, there will be that consistency there. So we understand each other better. We understand what those gives and gets are between the spokes, between themselves, and both between the hub and the spoke. And that will lead to better two-way communications. The other thing that we've done is make sure that we align the PMOs with what we're calling the organizational power lines. So actually, how do we make sure that actually everybody is focused on this North Star and everybody in the spokes can see how they're going to feed up through the hub and into that North Star? And if we can get that working as an iterative loop, actually, we will get a really powerful ecosystem from this. So the main point around this point is organizational context is absolutely critical. Most of the things that have changed, as I said at the start, are not around what we've done as a PMO out. They're about those things that have changed around us. And it was a really interesting lesson for me. I've been with the PMO for 2.5 years, or 2 years at the time, actually, and we were really struggling. We felt like we were reaching a ceiling. We felt like we couldn't go any further. We were trying really hard, but the frustrations were just non-solvable. Actually, what needed to happen was the organization needed to change around us. We needed to position the EPMO into a better place. We needed to make sure we understood how those spokes worked. We needed to get those communications working. And importantly, we had to put ourselves in the right place in the organization. The big change that we made was to make sure that the EPMO is now at the heart of decision-making within AWE. It's no longer on the periphery, something that people don't quite understand what it does. It's now right in the center, sitting alongside our financial management, our commercial management, is delivery of how we balance our program outputs to be able to meet our organizational objectives. So it's all about organizational context. And I find that really interesting because one of my challenges is that people always want to do a good job. We always want to move to the next stage. But how much of this is really in our control and how much we need to influence and push But actually, we can't make the decision to be like that. We have to wait and be patient for the organization, to some extent, to move with us.